Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. Tonight, we'll be exploring the multifaceted and hugely important topic of what the reclamation of Native rights looks like in the context of the 21st century. As activists and policymakers alike address issues ranging from water rights to self-governance for Native American and Indigenous communities, it is important to understand that these are not solely Native issues, but American issues. My name is Emmanuel Elii Kalivo, and I am the current student coordinator of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee here at the IOP. I'm a senior at Harvard College studying government with a secondary field in ethnicity, migration, and rights, and I'm currently zooming to you from my hometown of San Jose, California. As we continue through Native American Heritage Month this fall, it is not only important to combat erasure by uplifting Indigenous narratives in the United States, it is critical to take action on such issues after learning of the various struggles impacting these communities. We at the IOP hope that after the rich discussion with tonight's guests, you are able to take away knowledge that you may pay forward to others who may not share your background. Tonight's conversation features two very special guests. Delegate Kimberly Teehee is the Director of Government Relations for the Cherokee Nation and Senior Vice President of Government Relations for Cherokee Nation businesses. In 2019, Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. named her the tribe's first delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives, as guaranteed in the Cherokee Nation's 1835 Treaty of New Echota, and as outlined in the Cherokee Nation Constitution. Prior to returning home to the Cherokee Nation, she served as partner for Mapetsi Policy Group, a Washington, D.C.-based federal advocacy group representing Indian tribes and tribal organizations. She previously served President Barack Obama as the first ever senior policy advisor for Native American affairs in the White House Domestic Policy Council for 3 years. Andrew Lee of the Seneca Nation is an advocate, advisor, and father whose career spans the fields of philanthropy, American Indian affairs, and healthcare. Andrew began his career at the Ford Foundation in the mid-1990s, then served as executive director of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, where he founded the globally replicated Honoring Nations Awards program and co-authored The State of the Native Nations. From 2005 to 2015, Andrew worked at Aetna, where he held a variety of executive roles, including head of public policy, president of a technology startup, and chief of staff to the president and CEO. Among his current board responsibilities, Andrew is vice chairman of U.S. Lacrosse, a member of the board of governors for the Harvard Project Honoring Nations program, a director of the Tewa Foundation, and an advisor to numerous organizations working in Indian country. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Emmanuel. That was a great introduction. And to all of you who are tuning in, thank you for joining us for what I hope will be a really invigorating discussion. So I'm going to start right off, Kim. Let's dive right into it. We're really grateful for your time today. And I want to ask you first off to say a little bit more about what it means to be a delegate to Congress. And, you know, the basis for this, of course, is in treaty rights. And between 1777 and 1868, there were about 368 treaties signed between US commissioners and tribal leaders. Now, those treaties were absolutely foundational to the United States, and they represented promises made by the US to Indian nations, and they obviously carry great moral, legal, and historical weight. And even though they were routinely broken over the years, they were never extinguished. They are living treaties. They remain legally binding today, and they carry very practical significance to Native governments and citizens today. In a nutshell, treaties matter. Now, we found ourselves at a really interesting moment of time that's as significant as it is fascinating. Now, the Cherokee Nation is using its treaty rights enshrined in 1835 to exercise its sovereignty in governmental relations by appointing its first ever delegate to the US Congress. On August 29th of last year, the Cherokee Nation approved you, Kimberly Teehee, to be its first official representative to Congress. So first of all, Kim, I want to congratulate you on that important role for the nation. And for our audience, could you say a little bit more about what a delegate is? What is your job?
Sure. A delegate, you know, just by virtue of the definition that we would find in a dictionary, I suppose, is someone who is authorized to represent others. In my case, it's the government of the Cherokee Nation. And the treaty right is actually vested in what we call 5 documents, but I'm sure we'll get into that later. We had an earlier treaty right in 1785, but that referred to a deputy of our choosing in Congress. So a little bit vague. And it was refined in 1835, where that had the most express language that said that Cherokee Nation shall be entitled to a delegate in the U.S. House of Representatives whenever Congress makes provisions for the same. That's not a discretionary kind of thing, and it's never been abrogated. And as we know, treaties are the supreme law of the land. So that's what it is. And I can get into a little bit about what delegates are in Congress if you'd like. But
yeah,
that's essentially
I would imagine, Kim, that a lot of folks have on their mind, why now, right? So
Right.
that's a long period of time from that treaty signed to you being appointed as delegate. So why now?
Sure. So why now? I'll just go over, I talked about the 1785 treaty, talked about a deputy. It was refined in 1835. That is the express language that we're referring to today. Then an 1866 treaty that reaffirmed all prior treaties. And then in 2017, in an unrelated federal court case, the federal court ruled that Cherokee Nation must comply with the treaty responsibilities that it had under the 1866 treaty. Chief Hoskin, the current chief of the Cherokee Nation, was then Secretary of State. And he first got the idea of, if Cherokee Nation must honor its treaty obligations, then so should the United States. And Cherokee Nation didn't have, until the 2000s, provisions that gave the chief the authority to appoint a delegate. That wasn't until the 2000s. And so we also have a tribal constitution, which is the 5th document we look to, that empowers the chief of the Cherokee Nation to appoint a delegate to Congress in fulfillment of those treaties that I just outlined for you, and for the council to unanimously confirm me as well, which they did. And so this delegate position we maintain is similar to U.S. territory delegates in that those are non-voting delegates. There are differences, however, and I always say when we educate people about this treaty provision is that unlike U.S. territories, which took an act of Congress, our treaty right is already the supreme law of the land, and only the House needs to act to seat me. I think that's pretty much the consensus when we talk to lawmakers themselves. And I'm appointed. I'm not elected as a delegate. And that's because our elected leaders of the Cherokee Nation appointed and confirmed me. And in Congress, my constituent would be the Cherokee Nation, where I would represent the governmental interests of the nation. And whereas delegates and members of Congress represent their constituents who vote them into office. And so my constituent is the nation. Our individual citizens would still go to their elected leaders of the nation for their needs, just as the constituents of the congressional districts would still go to their members of Congress. There are also similarities, though. In Congress, for those of you who don't know, delegates have a lot of responsibilities. You can sponsor legislation, you can amend legislation, you can be assigned to committees, you can chair those committees, you can rise in leadership, you can hold leadership positions, you can speak on the House floor, you can do all those things that accompany legislative activity, but you can't vote on final passage. You can't vote on the House floor. That's what distinguishes members of Congress from delegates. But I always say, I want to honor the differences too, because even though I think we'll be treated the same as U.S. territory delegates, how we got there is different, and that matters. And why now is an interesting question, because it's one that we get asked a lot, and it's one that deserves some historical context here, because we don't often learn about the history of Indian tribes in school or in college unless we proactively seek that out. And for us, that story begins in the early 19th century. We had a very shaky relationship with the United States. Removal policies were taking place. Georgia started trying to, enact laws and apply them to the homelands of the Cherokee Nation. The U.S. had this goal of expanding to Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, the Appalachian Mountains. And we stood in the way of that goal because we didn't want removal. We fought that. And so we went to court. We chose the legal system. Back in the early 19th century, just to give you a sense of who we were, we had a constitution. We didn't live in teepees. We had a fully functioning economy, and we were successful. We had Sequoyah, who invented our syllabary, and we had a high literacy rate as well. We had a newspaper that was printed in Cherokee. And so we were very successful, and we chose the path of using the legal system in the United States to fight removal efforts. And we prevailed in early court decisions that are still used and considered seminal court cases today for those who practice federal Indian law in the 1830s, 1831 and 32 to be exact. We prevailed in the courts. The court said the state of Georgia had laws had no force or effect within the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation. But guess who was president? President Andrew Jackson, who pushed Indian removal policies. And in 1835, an illegal faction of the Cherokee Nation signed the Treaty of New Echota. That's our removal treaty. The very treaty that has this delegate provision is also the treaty that was signed that led to our forced removal and led to the assassination of those who signed that treaty too, by the way, for treason actions. So forced removal, 1838, all those things that we had built up in our original homeland, forever gone. Our people were forcibly removed beginning in 1838, where a quarter of our population perished, mostly elders and children. They died on this trail due to extreme weather conditions and also just because of the forced nature of this march. And, what I tell people is the bad stuff didn't just end there. It kept going until the 1970s. The Congress, kept acting and abolishing our court systems, abolishing our ability to pass laws and be governed by them, really crippling with their interference our ability to govern ourselves. And that kept going with these horrible, horrible policies. And it really wasn't until the 1970s. That wasn't so long ago. When Congress finally acted in 1975, actually that era was called the self-determination era. So in 1975, Congress acted again to give the tribes the ability to once again elect their chiefs. And so it took nation building on our part from the mid-70s to have a modern constitution, to start applying for grants, to start rebuilding a nation. Because we had to rebuild all that had taken place because all those laws basically from the early 19th centuries until the 1970s. And so, we did that. And it wasn't until 1999 when there was another constitutional convention of the Cherokee Nation. Chief Hoskin was a delegate to that constitutional convention that the delegates chose to include a provision that required the chief to appoint a delegate and for the council to confirm. And so that's kind of where we are now. I mean, in order to understand why now, you have to understand all the bad things that the courts and Congress and U.S. policy did to dismantle a nation, and then appreciate the rebuilding that it took up until now, where we could focus not just on the citizens, but to build a tribal economy where our citizens were being provided for with housing, healthcare, infrastructure needs and such, that we finally feel like we are able to pursue this treaty right. And that's, basically why now.
Yeah, that's great, Kim. And it really says a lot that the nation has institutionalized itself, overcome so many of those barriers that it's now in a position to take advantage of this treaty right, which, as you appropriately say, is the supreme law of the land. So thank you very much for that. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about American Indian affairs more generally. And when we talk about Indian affairs, we throw around terms like sovereignty, treaties, trust status, government-to-government relationship, all of which are very fundamental to Indian law and Indian policy. Yet I think these concepts are for many Americans, they're complex and they're not widely familiar to most Americans and even policymakers, as you know, having worked on the Hill for so many years. So I guess my question to you is like, could you break down, break down the language for us in a way that more people can understand when they contemplate some of the issues and battles the Indian nations are currently in? And that's everything from jurisdictional expansion to land rights issues, like the Dakota Access Pipeline. There's lots of issues out there. What do folks really need to know about, sort of the main features of American Indian law and policy to be able to have at least a basic understanding of how these issues play out?
I think first and foremost, our issues are complex, right? Because there is a whole body of law and federal court decisions that relate uniquely to us. We have a whole title in the United States Code. Title 25 is devoted to Indians. You read you read all the different titles of the U.S. Code, and you see one devoted just to Indians because it captures all the federal laws applied to us. And then there's the subsets of those laws that apply uniquely to subsets of tribes in different areas. It's complex, and that each tribe has its own history, has its own government, has its own culture, has its own language, and their own way of life. The thing that I like to impart in people, I spent nearly 12 years working for the U.S. Congress, running the Congressional Native American Caucus, and I made it my mission to educate, always educate. I held what was called Indian 101 briefings every legislative year because it was intended to get to the new members of Congress who wanted to know why the heck they were legislating in Indian affairs in the first place, and to educate staff as well about these issues. So one of the things that I like to tell people is that Indian country has a unique legal relationship with the United States. So when people want to know why are we legislating in Indian affairs, it's because there is a trust relationship. It is a true, real legal relationship, one that the United States can be sued for, and they have been sued for breach of that trust. That's one. Two, we're sovereign. We are sovereign nations that entered into treaties with the United States, and that those treaties are the supreme law of the land, and that these tribal nations have the ability to make decisions and be governed by those decisions and can determine what's best for the citizens that they have. The other thing I would say too, because this comes up often, especially in lawsuits and in legislation, because people don't understand the issues, is when it comes to who we are as a people. Indians, who are we? We're not a race, right? We're not really a race, not in legal terms. When there are federal laws in place that give us advantages and opportunities, those aren't handouts. Our ancestors have blood, sweat, and tears on that trail of tears and they fought to have the promises kept and for resources to be delivered to them. And the reason that those laws are in place and are legal is because, Indian preference laws are considered political. So federal courts have upheld this time and time again, whether it's special preference laws in hiring, in government contracting, and in other spaces. That we as citizens of tribal governments that are sovereign governments, those federal laws apply to us because we are political based, not race based laws. And so I think those are some of the stuff that I like to kind of get across to people as we talk about, Indian country and some of the complexities of the laws. It's really trying to break down things that seem complex when they're really not, once you understand them and have context for them.
Great, that's very helpful. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit more about self-governance, something that you raised a few minutes ago. And,
okay.
So where I sit, the story of Indian country is fundamentally a story of strength and resilience in the face of tremendous obstacles and outright attacks. And Trail of Tears is a great example of that. Attempted extermination, land removal, and the creation of reservations. We had boarding schools and other assimilationist policies, and so on and so on. And despite all of this, Indian nations and Native people have shown themselves really as survivors. We faced the fiercest winds of oppression, and we're still here. And while it's true that American Indians as a population continue to reside near or at the bottom of virtually every socioeconomic indicator, we've been in the midst of a renaissance for the past 40-some years. And you mentioned this earlier, the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act of 1975 really marked an important shift in federal Indian policy by giving tribes greater opportunities to govern themselves. And this era of self-determination and self-governance has seen a growing number of tribes governing themselves to better futures. And it's something that the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development has studied intensely. You know, the Harvard Project's core conclusion is that successful tribes assert their sovereignty and back up those assertions of sovereignty by creating capable and culturally appropriate institutions of self-governance. And one of the things that the Harvard Project has done, and I think has been a big success, has been to showcase these tribal self-governance success stories. And so the Honoring Nations program since 1999 has celebrated nearly 150 honorees across a full spectrum of topic areas. And they really give us some compelling examples of tribal success under this era of self-governance. And everyone should know that the Cherokee Nation has been very well represented in these awards, where the Cherokee Nation History course was really about teaching culture and history to all Cherokee employees. And by the way, there are a lot of non-native Cherokee employees. I think you have around 11,000 employees working for the Cherokee Nation now. The Cherokee Nation Youth Choir, which is a great and very tangible way to showcase Cherokee culture and engage youth essentially as ambassadors. And the Cherokee Language Revitalization Program, in the early 2000s, I guess the nation did a study that found that there were no fluent speakers of the Cherokee language under the age of 40. And therefore, the nation created immersion programs, a degree program for language, and lots of community language activities. So I want to know, and I think all of us would be curious to hear from your perspective, why has the Cherokee Nation been so aggressive in self-governance? What has made you so successful? Why this aggressive push for your sovereignty and to build those kinds of institutions that can not only get stuff done, but are really shining examples for all governments to see, whether they're native or non-native? You've got an exceptional housing program. You've done pioneering work in treatment and programs for survivors of domestic abuse. All of these things tell us that the Cherokee Nation is deeply committed to self-governance. Tell us a little bit more about that and why the nation's been so aggressive in this front, whether there are any challenges that are really associated with that. And I think one of the final things I'll say, and then I'll let you talk, is, what are the next frontiers for Cherokee sovereignty and Cherokee expressions of self-governance?
Thank you for that. And thank you for expressing such knowledge and appreciation for the work of the Cherokee Nation. People probably have different views about this question that you just asked, but I've had the unique experience of being an intern for former Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation, Wilma Mankiller. And I got an opportunity to see her lead and to have a team of people around her that she trusted as trusted advisors. And I got to see her work from when she was not known internationally or nationally to when she was, famous. And her work ethic was never changed. She knew that we needed to be empowered to make the decisions to help ourselves. She was honored for having established as a community organizer what's called the Bell Project. And it was to bring infrastructure to these rural communities where there was no resources to do it, and people were too poor to help themselves. And essentially, I'm oversimplifying the importance of this program and the value of it, but they basically, through sweat equity, had to help put the infrastructure in themselves. And so she knew the value of helping ourselves from her community organizing and help shepherd in for ourselves self-determination policies. When Congress passed the laws that first authorized tribes to enter into these agreements with the federal government, we were one of the first tribes to enter into these agreements, and it has proven to be successful. I think history has shown us time and time again, for those of you who are fortunate to follow this history, that Indian country, Indian tribes do best when we are the best decision makers and can make those decisions for our people and are given the adequate resources to address those needs. So you can see this trend from the era of self-determination where, where 10 years later, you saw progress. 20 years later, here we are in 2020, and you still see great progress. But you also see tribes that have tried to build tribal economies. The federal government cannot possibly meet all the needs of Indian country through federal funding. There's shortfalls all over the place. So Indian country, despite policies that put us in these rural settings and impoverished settings, Indian country has done its best to build up their economies and to try, and that has freed up their capital to take on additional things and additional projects. And so I think that we recognize our history. We try to avoid repeating mistakes, and we've taken off and built upon the foundation that had been laid for us. We began this conversation with Delegate and why now. If Chief Baker wasn't around in the last 2 terms that he served for office and was able to put us on a strong economic path and build up our businesses, I don't know that Chief Hoskin would have felt like he was able to appoint a delegate. But that foundation was laid. It's time to go to the next level. So our elected leaders who can build upon the foundation and who take those great strides and approaches, I think is necessary in order to continue to thrive in this space. Now, when I think of self-governance, I actually think of kind of 2 concepts here. One is self-governance that is a term we use in the federal Indian law space, because that typically refers to the contracts we enter into with federal agencies like the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the Indian Health Service, and we're able to sort of take over those federal programs ourselves, which is self-determination and self-governance policies. But there's also the broader concept of self-governance, right? The ability for ourselves to make the decisions that we know are best for our nation. The other thing that I think has been remarkable is, what you work on, Andrew, which is Harvard Honoring Nations. This compilation of best practices throughout Indian country and the publications that you guys put out there, and the ability to replicate these successful programs. Someone once told me one time, because he often helps other tribal nations, because they want to learn how they were able to be successful at things. And he says he's always willing to get the playbook. But if you're not able to play, then the playbook won't matter much. And so we always make sure that we have the best people that we can to put us on a path forward, that we're always forward thinking, and that we are trying to do what's best for our citizens. I mean, we're a large nation. We have more than 385,000 citizens. By the way, citizens in every state. And so we have to do a lot, because we have a lot of needs within our reservation and on the outside of the reservation too. So we just keep plugging away.
Tease us a little bit with what's in store for the future. What are some of the areas of self-governance that, are on the horizon
right.
that we get excited about? Very briefly, just give us just a taste of
something I'm very excited about right now. We partnered with the Oklahoma State University, and we are building and almost completing, actually, the very first medical school on an Indian reservation. That's innovation, and that's self-governance. That hospital is being built because we know in Oklahoma, the average age of the doctor is very old. They're elderly. And that rural health is suffering because not enough doctors are out there. Luckily, Oklahoma State University has a mission to try to build up more doctors in rural communities. That matched our need perfectly. And so we already have students who have started their class. They're not learning in the building yet because the building is not complete. So we actually have a brand new outpatient facility where they are holding class right now virtually and some in person. But that is exciting, right? I accompanied Chief Baker to Chicago because we had to go before the accreditation board. This blew their mind. And we didn't know what kinds of questions that were going to be asked of us because the accreditation board didn't know why the Bureau of Indian Affairs within the Department of the Interior had a role to play here because they have lease approvals, right? We know federal laws apply uniquely to us, and we had to explain why that was, and that wasn't a bad thing, but they just didn't understand it. We didn't know how they were going to perceive this partnership with Oklahoma State University, and when we made the presentation, we had scheduled half a day for the board because we'd heard they weren't shy about asking challenging questions. And when the presentation was finished and we talked about the health indicators in our communities and the need to build your own doctors concurrently with our efforts to build the surrounding community economies, to create jobs so that we can incentivize the doctors that are being trained at our medical school to stay here because we can employ their wife, we can give their kids a stellar education, and we can provide them good housing and good opportunities here locally. It all goes hand in glove together. When we told that story, Chief Baker got not a single question. He got applause. And we were able to go earlier that day. But it was impressive because it was the first ever. We just didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what to expect. But we had to educate because the thing about partnering with people who are not used to partnering with us is that we have to lift the veil of mystery. We have to show that, we're not some small mom and pop shop. We are big and we are successful and we have great needs. Look, our healthcare system, we see 1.4 million patient visits annually. That is major. And we know Oklahoma is poor.
Kim, I actually want to stick on this subject of healthcare and specifically public health, and talk a little bit about COVID, because this pandemic has, clearly been devastating for Indian nations. And, as a whole, the pandemic is just getting worse. There have been more than 11.3 million cases in the US, 250,000 deaths. And just yesterday, in fact, was the deadliest day we've had in 6 months with over 1,700 deaths in a single day. And at the state level, Oklahoma, where the Cherokee Nation is located, is also struggling. 158,000 cases and more than 1,500 deaths in the state. And Oklahoma is one of only 16 states today that does not have a statewide mask requirement. But more generally for Indian country, the pandemic's been really devastating. The case rate for American Indians and Alaska Natives, is between 3 and 4 times the general population rate. And Natives are, 5 times as likely to be hospitalized as white people. The Navajo Nation, lots of other Indian nations are hurting badly, and the negative trends really aren't letting up at all. And yet the Cherokee Nation seems to be in the driver's seat for controlling this pandemic, amidst a nation in which the virus is spiraling out of control. And for Cherokee, you have 140,000 citizens living on the reservation out of the 385,000 total Cherokee citizens, but 140 living on the reservation, which is essentially the size of Connecticut. But you've only had, 4,000 cases and 33 deaths? I mean, that's amazing, right? The Cherokee Nation, I know, has a mask mandate. There's free testing. One of the things that you've invested in is data collection, strong supplies of PPE, and really highly qualified public health officials. In fact, the Cherokee Nation is the largest, for those of you who don't know, it's the largest tribal health system in the US. And I guess the question I have that maybe you could shed a little insight in is, how has Chief Hoskin been able to sustain public support for this very aggressive COVID response that has, by all accounts, been tremendously effective so far? And what do you think some of the other leaders, both Native and non-Native, can learn from the Cherokee Nation response to the COVID pandemic?
You've got to act swiftly. You've got to be guided by the facts, by science, and you've got to have compassion. You've got to act swiftly. When Congress passed 2 stimulus packages and Indian country was not included, and at the beginning, that was a problem because, like everybody else, every other tribe in the country, we were clamoring for PPE, right? We had to act swiftly because we knew, as the largest nation, tribal nation in the country, that we have more citizens who are impacted than probably other tribes. And so we worked very closely, that was my job. I worked very closely with the National Congress of American Indians and others, and the lawyer, a lot of the people who I used to work closely with when I was in DC, and we fought to make sure tribes were included in a third COVID stimulus relief package. We got $8 billion. We asked for more, but we got what we needed. We also were aggressive in seeking PPE. I think we were the first tribal nation to actually get PPE from the national stockpile. We just tried to cobble together what we knew was available to us while we tried to also get Congress to act. Chief Hoskin, he didn't waste any time. He immediately sent us home. Our last trip to DC was in beginning of March on the delegate issue. And we still have a travel restriction. He immediately signed an executive order. We have a mask mandate in the Cherokee Nation. All elders, all employees over 65 and over are still home. They don't come here. We're still at a 50% workforce at the nation. And everyone that comes through our doors must be wearing a mask. If you don't have one, we'll give you one. And you get your temperature tested. We have rapid testing now that's available at our facilities. Our school was shut down, and it wasn't without some beating. He got criticized by the parents for putting in the measures that he thought were in the best interest of our citizens and our students. But we don't live in a bubble. We're surrounded by cities, all of our, we have, city partners who've taken a different strategy and a different approach. But all we could do is do the best that we could do. Look, when we saw that COVID was an issue, Chief Hoskin wanted to keep our elders home and safe. And then we saw food flying off the shelves. And when we closed our doors at school, we also knew that our students oftentimes relied on that lunchtime meal as sometimes maybe the only meal of the day. And so we quickly acted and worked with local restaurants, and we started buying their inventory because they had it shut down. And then we started working with USDA to get food out. Andrew and we are still doing food delivery. We are still doing what we can to keep our elders safe and at home. And even though we have over 4,600 COVID positive cases in our healthcare system and 35 deaths, we have about 10 who are Cherokee speakers. We know our elders are our most vulnerable population. We also know we also know American Indians have some of the highest rates of diabetes, obesity, heart disease, chronic illnesses that make us a high-risk population. And so Chief Hoskin took immediate steps to try to make sure that we were going to people, or we had, drive-through food distributions. We have served 96,000 citizens with meals, and I haven't done the math yet, so I was looking at somebody did the math for me. That's equivalent to 6.1 million meals since COVID started that we have served our citizens. We have provided our students with distance learning resources they need for computers, laptops, the teachers as well. We have helped our veterans, our citizens with disabilities, our elders with stipends that they need for technology, for food, whatever their needs are. But we have tried to make sure that whatever the needs are, that we keep in here. My assistant actually left early today, so she could go to a community and deliver PPE to an elder. She runs our elder hotline, and that's our priority, is our elders and our students. Because who perished during Trail of Tears, right? Our elders and our children. We've got to protect them, so we do our best there. But we're also doing other things. We are presently, because the food crisis, people couldn't buy meat. Meat was skyrocketing, the price of meat was. So we are building a meat processing center because we want to be able to make sure that our citizens have access to a major source of food, protein. We are building employee clinics around the community. We are building up our community centers and equipping them with freezers, because we also ran into the issue of storing the food once we got it. And so we're building up in a way that we won't be caught off guard again. in the second wave or if another wave comes on down the road. But we're making great strides to do all that we can do. And on the business side, go ahead.
Yeah, it's so
encouraging.
You know, I think history will show that the Cherokee Nation was truly a leader in this, and so we're all, you know, looking to you to help lead us out of this crisis, because it's a humanitarian crisis, and it's wonderful to see an indigenous nation sort of taking this thing by the reins and really excelling in a very, very difficult environment. I want to shift gears to a Q&A and invite some of our participants to ask you some questions as well. In the spirit of you know, the way we do things as natives, we always acknowledge the land that we're on, and although we're virtual today, we just want to recognize that the land that Harvard sits on is indigenous land, and the Ash Center and the folks at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development are really grateful for this opportunity to have this kind of exchange. And so it's a long history of Harvard having exchanges on important issues, and it starts with native roots. So I want to recognize that and invite our first student. His name's Gayotri from the college to ask a question. So Gayotri, please go right ahead. There he is. Looks like he's on mute right now. Okay, while we wait for that, why don't we, Kim, there's a question I want to ask you. If you could be pretty brief about it. You know, in 62 days, we're going to have a new administration. And with that comes obviously a lot of opportunities and challenges. What are some of the biggest opportunities you see in working with the new administration?
Well, keep in mind, Andrew, I was a senior policy advisor in the Obama-Biden administration. So I've already had a chance to work with President-elect Biden when he served as vice president. And I can tell you, I enjoyed my time working with him. You know, when President Obama signed off on the policy proposal to give tribes the legal authority to prosecute non-Indians who commit domestic violence against Indian women on an Indian land, I had to get first permission from Vice President Biden. I had to make sure he was comfortable with that policy, and he was. You know, without question, using the VAWA as the resource, as the vehicle for that policy. So I'm looking forward to it. Hey, and if you guys are following national news right now, then you should also know that we're on the cusp of possibly having our very first Native American cabinet level position. You know, Deb Haaland, who's the current Congresswoman from New Mexico, she lives in Pueblo, is on the short list for to be Interior Secretary. And I will just say the short list is shared with former Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico also. Indian country will have champions in both, but man, it would be awesome to break the glass ceiling if President-elect Biden were to appoint Deb to be the Interior Secretary. That would be awesome, and I would expect great things. I feel President Obama has been the most successful recent president to work on Indian affairs issues, and he set the bar. And I feel like, you know, there's opportunity for Biden to go farther.
Great. Well, fingers crossed for great things to come. So our next question is from Emmanuel, who's got a question for us. Emmanuel, can you go ahead, chime right in?
Hello. So my question was about the recent Supreme Court decision in McGirt v. Oklahoma, which held that much of Oklahoma, I think actually up to half, if not more than half of Oklahoma's land is still considered native land, Indian country. And I guess I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the implications of that decision for your nation, for the other nations in the state, especially regarding fossil fuel extraction in a state that relies very heavily on that economically.
Right. So the McGirt case actually involved the Muskogee Creek Nation and their 1866 treaty. I referenced our 1866 treaty earlier. And each of what's called the 5 civilized tribes, that's what they're known in various acts of Congress, but that's 5 tribes. Each of the 5 tribes have similar legal histories with regard to that 1866 treaty in particular, and they have similar language. So even though that U.S. Supreme Court case really only applies to Muskogee Creek Nation, the fact is, by extension, it's applying to us. Now, we already have 100+ cases in the various areas of our reservation where our reservation status is being challenged. To date, we have prevailed on each case. We've had about a handful of cases so far. The orders have come down, and following the McGirt analysis, the courts have ruled in our favor that our reservation has also not been disestablished. So it is unique. In the civil space, two things have happened. One is in 2005, Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma included a rider, legal language that gave EPA, or that gave the states some authorities that they did not previously have. And so the governor is trying to invoke a 2005 law that gives them some authorities on our reservation land, except for land that's considered trust property or restricted fee property. That's technical jargon, I won't get into it, that the tribes are resisting. So the conversations we've had, much like this call, has been in an education space, because that court case really involves a criminal jurisdiction case, and we're all trying to figure out how best to use the limited resources we have to address those criminal jurisdictional cases. In the civil space, tribal authorities are quite limited when it comes to non-Indian companies. And so we believe if there are issues there, we can work them out through compacting with the state of Oklahoma in the fossil fuel space and any number of spaces.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for that question, Emmanuel. I know that's on the minds of a lot of folks. We have a question from Doris, who's an alum. So Doris, go right ahead and ask your question, please.
All right, now you can hear me?
Just
yes,
fine.
ma'am, we can hear you.
Good. My question is, I'm a little confused. Now the Cherokee Nation is going to have a delegate to Congress. Now, how about the other nations? Do they have delegates, or how does this work? Or is there, I heard recently that all the Indian nations have gathered together in sort of a group. And is there a representative from that group? Could you tell me more about that?
So Doris, you asked me a very important question, and I'm glad you did, hon, because that's one of the questions we get asked from lawmakers. You know, is this going to open the floodgate to all the other tribal nations having a delegate in Congress? The answer is no, no. But we are not the only tribe with the treaty rights. We have the most clear language in law, in our treaties. It expressly states Cherokee shall have a delegate in the House of Representatives. There are two other treaties. A 1778 treaty with the Delaware tribe exists. It gives them a similar right. Language is vague though, but it does give them a similar right. There is an 1830 treaty called the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. That's the treaty that included the Choctaws and the Chickasaws. And so they also have similar rights. So our tribes are the only tribes in the country that have that treaty right. So the floodgates wouldn't open, but there is an argument that the Delaware tribe, there is an argument that the Choctaw Chickasaw, because of that one treaty, have similar rights than we do. Now, this is interesting because Congressman Tom Cole from Oklahoma, who's a Chickasaw citizen, you know, has asked a lot of legal questions about this. And so we engaged a firm to do some legal analysis and came to the conclusion that, you know, the non-voting delegate was the best path to go so as not to offend the Constitution with dual representation arguments. But that's it. That's the universe of delegates. I'm not aware of other tribes that gather and have representation. There are plenty of tribal organizations that exist and that represent tribal interests through their membership, and they're very, very powerful too, but they don't actually represent them in Congress. By the way, I want to mention this. We now have, going into this next Congress, we will have more Native representation than we have ever had in the history of this nation. And that gives me goosebumps just talking about it right now. I remember when I worked on the Hill many years ago as a Hill staffer, there was a time when there was not a single Native American member of Congress. And I remember when I was one of maybe 2 or 3 staff on the House side, I worked for the House of Representatives, who were Native American. And so today that has changed. Today we have 3 Democrats who are Native American, or 2 Native American, 1 Native Hawaiian, and then 3 Republicans. So it's bipartisan. But my hope is that they will all be champions. You know, we happen to have 2 Cherokee citizens. Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma, who's actually our representative in Congress, is a Cherokee citizen. Yvette Harrell out of New Mexico is also a Cherokee Nation citizen. We've already been in touch with her. And then, of course, you guys know Deb Holland from New Mexico. She's Laguna Pueblo. Sharice Davis is Ho-Chunk Nation citizen. And then Kai Kaeli from Hawaii is Native Hawaiian. And so this is remarkable, a remarkable time for diversity in the Congress. And I think that that is wonderful.
Great. Thank you very much for that question, Doris. We've got a question from Amy Medford from the Ash Center. And for those of you who don't know, the Ash Center is the institutional home of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. So at some point, I hope you'll take the time to learn a little bit more about the Harvard Project and honoring nations and all of the great work that's taking place at the Kennedy School. So Amy, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for being with us today. I think it's been informative for me as somebody who has a background in American Indian policy and is interested in this area, but is also very excited to see the Cherokee Nation send a delegate into Congress. As soon as I heard that the Cherokee Nation had this in their treaty, I have been, silently cheering you all on in the background, waiting for this to happen.
Silent. You're welcome to yell it loudly.
Well, and my question comes back to a little bit related to the McGirt issue. I feel that a lot of issues around Indian country stem from misunderstanding, and you spent a lot of time when you were at the Native American Caucus educating House of Representatives. Do you think that would be a similar role that you would play as a delegate, or do you see the role sort of shifting a little bit and going beyond sort of just the educator role and really sort of participating in this dialogue with fellow representatives?
My hope is that it shifts. I've been a Hill staffer already. I'm not going to DC to be another Hill staffer again, right? But I also will not step back from an opportunity to educate. We have seen great victories in Indian country because we've had members of Congress who are so invested in our issues that they get to learn and they appreciate the complexities of our issues, and they're able to have member level conversations. And sometimes things happen in our favor because a member of Congress is willing to have member level conversations. So I would not mind having to have that education background, because no person knows it all on every issue. And our issues can be so complex and so thorny that we have to educate on that. You talked about the McGirt decision. Our delegation is hearing from all of their constituents, whether it's the tribe, corporations, state leaders. They're trying to figure it out too. And then some are freaking out because they think sky is falling scenario and not sure what it means because the Indians might have jurisdiction over them and trying to figure it out. And so they're looking, there's actually proposals to just establish our reservations, just, trying to, respond to the court decision. And so we are in turn proactively educating and trying to make sure that those disestablishment policies don't occur again in our lifetime. And I think we have momentum. I think it's just a non-starter to have it, but it's troubling that an industry thinks it's okay to offer up legislation to disestablish our reservations. But it does take a great deal of education. My goal would not be to continue to be a staffer for somebody and to continue to educate, but I won't skirt that either, because I've seen the effectiveness that comes when somebody understands and appreciates our issues.
Thank you.
So let me push you on that, Kim, a little bit. So what are your immediate priorities when you get to DC?
You know what? thank you for that question, Andrew, because I can tell you number one and number two, it all relates to funding. You know, we need more COVID dollars. You know, Congress needs to pass another stimulus package, and we need more dollars. Not only do we need more dollars, but we need the date, the deadline to spend down those dollars, because we have to spend all of our money by December 3rd, and somehow miraculously, we don't have to wait for another COVID to come in, and where are we gonna have the resources if we don't get more dollars? 3, we need flexibility on how we use that money. The restrictions that Treasury keeps putting on us is stymieing our ability to really respond in a real impactful way. We're doing the best we can, and I told you some of the innovative things that we're doing with our dollars, but man, that's just us. There are other tribes that are struggling, I assure you for that. Number 2, appropriations also. We are looking at a December 11th deadline of our continuing resolution to fund the government. As you know, Cherokee Nation, we receive a majority of our funds from the federal government, not because we can't handle the dollars ourselves on the business side, but because these are real dollars stemming from the trust responsibility to us. The government owes us that money, right? That's a responsibility they owe to us. But if government shuts down on December 11th, you know, that means that the poorest of the poor tribes are going to suffer. That means our healthcare delivery systems, our law enforcement, public safety systems are stymied unless the tribe has their own independent non-federal dollars to fund those things. So number 1 would be funding. Funding right now, 95% of the funding that tribes receive are called discretionary dollars. So guess what stops and ceases to be used when when federal government shuts down? Discretionary funded programs. And so I think that Indian country deserves to have funding either be mandatory funded, the way Social Security is mandatory funded, the way the SNAP program, which is a food stamp program, is mandatory funded. We don't have something similar. When shutdown occurs, the food distribution program for Indian reservations, that's our commodity, right? Our commodities. Those cease unless the tribe has the ability to fund it themselves. But guess what doesn't cease? The SNAP program. Its non-Indian counterpart does not cease. So by providing mandatory funding or at least advanced appropriations so that we don't run into this problem would be critical for us. So I think, that would be key.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy, for that question. Now we're coming to the top of the hour, and so I want to just pause and send a big thank you to the Institute of Politics and the Harvard Kennedy School for putting together this forum event in celebration of Native American Heritage Month. Thank you to all of you who got onto this call and participated. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as I did. I learned a lot. And Kim, thank you for all that you offered. Really a special thank you to Kimberly Teehee from the Cherokee Nation. Kim, you've given us a lot to think about, and I think we're all grateful to hear your wonderful perspectives and thoughtful perspectives about your great Cherokee Nation and its future. And I think, on behalf of all of those who were able to participate in this session, I think with leaders like you, Native nations and Native peoples everywhere have lots of reasons to be optimistic about the future. So I want to wish everybody who participated a wonderful holiday season and that you may all stay safe and healthy. So thank you very much.
Thank you.